Imagine this. You're pulling a 20-foot horse trailer down a sun-baked gravel road. The dust of 1,000 miles still clinging to your windshield, and all you want is to see the iron gates of your family ranch and smell the rain hitting the Texas soil, but instead, you're met with a wall of red and blue strobes slicing through the dusk. 3 squad cars are parked sideways across my entrance, and standing right there in the middle of the chaos, arms crossed and wearing a smirk so sharp it could cut glass, is Eleanor Vance, a woman who moved into the cookie-cutter subdivision next door exactly 90 days ago. She looked like she'd just won the Powerball, bouncing slightly on her heels while the deputy approached my truck window with that look on his face. You know the one. The look of a man who'd rather be wrestling an alligator than dealing with a neighborhood dispute. He tipped his hat, looking exhausted, and told me they'd received a formal trespassing complaint from a resident claiming I didn't oppose. belong on the property, and I just sat there for a second, letting the diesel engine idle, looking at Eleanor, then at the weathered sign hanging over my gate that read, and quote, Stone Creek Ranch, EST 1892, end quote. And back at this woman who thought she could police a century of history with a clipboard and a bad attitude. I leaned out the window, the scent of sagebrush and exhaust filling my lungs, and I said, and quote, Officer, I think you should meet the woman who just called the cops on the man who happens to be the new regional director for federal housing oversight, end quote. And let me tell you, watching her face go from a victory lap to a total meltdown was like watching a sandcastle hit by a tidal wave. My name is Silas Stone, and for the last 4 months, I've been living out of a suitcase in a cramped apartment in D.C., burying myself in federal statutes and administrative law, because when my father passed away, he left me a lot more than just 2,000 acres of rolling hills and a legacy of cattle ranching. He left me with a sense of duty, but he also left a void that the Federal Housing Administration was more than happy to fill with a massive promotion, making me the guy responsible for investigating crooked HOA boards and development scams across 5 states. I'd spent my days in marble buildings learning how to dismantle corrupt housing associations, while back home, my foreman, Miller, was dealing with a different kind of pest, the, end quote, Highland Crest, end quote, estate's a luxury development marketed as, end quote, authentic frontier living, end quote, for people who wanted the view of a ranch without the reality of a cow. And Eleanor Vance was their self-appointed queen, a woman with the nervous energy of a caffeinated squirrel and a bite like a timber wolf, who had decided that her 3-bedroom suburban villa was the new moral compass for Milburn County. Miller had been calling me every week with updates that sounded like a comedy routine, telling me how Eleanor was out there with a laser rangefinder measuring the height of our perimeter fences, or how she called the county health department because our prize bulls were, and I'm quoting her here, end quote, emitting unrefined organic odors that compromised her outdoor yoga sessions, end quote. I'd been home for less than 10 minutes when she tried to have me arrested, but that was just the opening act of a war she didn't oppose. T realized I'd already won before I even stepped off the plane. See, Eleanor had spent her first few months in Texas building a, end quote, Property Standards Committee, end quote, which was really just a group of 3 retirees she'd bullied into helping her document every time a tractor started up before 8 a.m. or a cow mooed too loudly near a patio. She'd sent me these glossy, certified letters back in D.C., filled with legal-sounding jargon about, end quote, nuisance abatement, end quote, and, end quote, aesthetic compatibility, end quote, basically demanding that I move my entire cattle operation to the far side of the property because the site of agricultural equipment was, end quote, distressing to the community's visual harmony, end quote. I remember sitting in my office at the FHA, looking at her letterhead and realizing that she had no idea her little subdivision was built on land that only existed because of a federal tax incentive program, a program that, ironically, put her entire HOA under my direct professional jurisdiction. The real tension boiled over a few days later when I ran into her at the local hardware store, a place where the air usually smells like sawdust and old oil, but that day it smelled like Eleanor's expensive perfume and pure entitlement. She cornered me near the irrigation supplies, her smile looking like a row of polished piano keys, and she didn't oppose. To even say hello, she just launched into a lecture about, end quote, modernizing the local landscape, end quote. She told me, with this terrifyingly calm condescension that, in quote, times were changing, in quote, and that my, in quote, antiquated lifestyle, in quote, was dragging down the property values of people who had actually invested in the future of the county. I stood there, holding a box of fence staples, and I told her as politely as I could that my family had been paying taxes on this land since the days of the stagecoach, and that her, in quote, future, in quote, was built on a foundation of my, in quote, past, in quote. She didn't in oppose. Tea like that one bit, leaning in close enough for me to see the fury behind her designer sunglasses, whispering that she had, in quote, friends in high places, in quote, and that by the time she was done, the county would zone my ranch out of existence. What she didn't in oppose, T know, what she couldn't in oppose, T possibly have grasped, was that I wasn't in oppose, T just some, in quote, legacy rancher, in quote. She could steamroll with a few phone calls to a city councilman. While she was busy organizing Facebook groups to complain about the dust from my cattle drives, I had my legal team and my federal investigators digging into the, in quote, Highland Crest, in quote, development files, and what we found was a goldmine of corruption that made her noise complaints look like a joke. It turns out, the developer who built her precious neighborhood had cut every corner in the book, including skipping out on a mandatory $300,000 environmental drainage system that was supposed to protect my ranch from their runoff. Not only that, but because they'd accepted federal infrastructure grants, their HOA was legally required to maintain a 200-foot, in quote, agricultural buffer, in quote, between their houses and my fence line, a buffer that Eleanor's own house was currently sitting right in the middle of. The climax of this whole mess happened at a public hearing she demanded, thinking she was going to humiliate me in front of the whole town. She showed up with a PowerPoint presentation, charts showing, in quote, decibel spikes, in quote, for my morning feedings and photos of my cows looking, in her words, in quote, aggressively unkempt, end quote. The room was packed with her neighbors, some looking bored, and others looking like they'd been brainwashed into thinking I was the villain of the story. Eleanor stood at the podium for 20 minutes, painting a picture of a, in quote, rogue agricultural operation, in quote, that was terrorizing a peaceful residential utopia, and when she finally sat down, looking smug and tapping her manicured nails on the table, I just walked up to the mic with a single folder. I didn't in oppose, T talk about the cows, and I didn't in oppose, T talk about the smell. I talked about federal compliance. I laid out the maps showing that 22 of the houses in her subdivision, including hers, were built in violation of the federal grant conditions, and that because the developer had gone bankrupt, the legal and financial liability for those violations now fell squarely on the HOA. The silence in that room was so thick you could have felt it on your skin as I explained that the, in quote, nuisance, in quote, she'd been documenting so carefully, the noise, the dust, the activity, was actually the legal baseline that protected my ranch under the, in quote, right to farm, in quote, act, and that by documenting it, she had actually provided all the evidence I needed to prove that her subdivision was the one infringing on my pre-existing rights. I looked right at her and said, in quote, Eleanor, you spent 3 months trying to find a way to get me off my land, but all you did was prove that your house shouldn't in oppose to even be there, end quote. The fallout was instant. The neighbors started turning on her right then and there because they realized that if I pushed the issue, the federal government could claw back the grants, which would mean a special assessment of about $15,000 per household to fix the drainage issues the developer ignored. Watching her world crumble wasn't and oppose. T as satisfying as I thought it would be. It was actually a little sad, seeing how much energy she'd wasted on hate when she could have just been a good neighbor. She tried to sue, of course, but her board of directors fired her within 48 hours. And the last I heard, she's been trying to sell her house for months, but nobody wants to buy into a neighborhood that's in a legal standoff with a federal oversight director. Now, when I ride my horse along the fence line at sunset, the only thing I hear is the wind in the grass and the occasional sound of a neighbor waving at me from their porch, finally realizing that the ranch ISN and oppose, a nuisance. It's the heart of the valley. But it makes me wonder, in a world where everyone is so obsessed with their own, in quote, property values, in quote, and in quote, community standards, in quote, have we completely lost the ability to just live and let live? Or is there always going to be someone like Eleanor trying to pave over history because they dawn into oppos? Do you like the way it smells? I want to know what you think. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who tried to change the rules of the game just because they moved into the neighborhood? Drop your stories in the comments, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's had to defend his home from a clipboard-wielding Karen.